Hi, my name is Martin Purnell, and welcome to Off-Grid Christianity, a weekly podcast for those who go or don't go to church, and where we can meet and hear from those that have made their faith count. This podcast series is to encourage via conversation and not necessarily change your mind prior to listening. You can contact us as well by email, ogc@accessradio.biz, and biz is spelled B-I-Z. So please enjoy today's guest, who is the son of a former Archbishop of Sydney, the Most Reverend Peter Jensen. Our guest is the rector of St Mark's Church, Darling Point in Sydney, which is one of Australia's most well-known churches, having featured in films and magazines for socialite weddings for decades. Our guest has written many books, including his latest, which was published this year. Our guest is also a co-host on the With All Due Respect podcasts. So why is he interested in theological anthropology? What is theological anthropology? What was it like growing up with your dad and then having to go to Oxford where his dad was studying at university? What is his latest book, Subjects and Citizens, The Politics of the Gospel, all about, and why did he write it? How did he get the former PM of Australia and the current Deputy First Minister of Scotland, for instance, to endorse his latest book? And why did he choose martyrdom and identity as his subject for his doctorate? All these questions gives me great pleasure to welcome all the way from Australia, Michael Jensen. Michael, thank you so much for joining us today. It's early morning, well, mid-morning here. What time is it over there and whereabouts are you, sir?
Thanks for having me, Martin. It's what we call tea time, which is dinner, evening meal, about 7 o'clock in the evening, depending on where you're from. I'm in Sydney, Australia. So Australia's, it's just become the second largest city because it's been overtaken by Melbourne, which we're very upset about. But it is the most beautiful city in Australia.
Wow, did not know that. Thank you. Excellent. Well, we've got loads of questions to ask. So, fingers on the buzzers, no conferring. Question number one. If you could invite anybody from history for an evening meal, alive or dead, so that you could ask them questions, who would it be?
I'm a bit of a theology buff and history buff, and I reckon Martin Luther, not Martin Luther King, although he would be interesting too, but Martin Luther, the great German reformer, because he was actually famous for his dinner time conversation.
Was he?
They've actually recorded his what they called his table talk, and he was quite a raconteur. Could be a little bit blue, a little bit ribald, you might say, and but extremely insightful. You wouldn't want to get on the wrong side of him, and he had, a dark side as well. But also, I think he created an absolute revolution in human culture and human history, and it'd be fascinating to sit at his table.
This is brilliant, because if I got into my time machine and brought him back to our time, A, can you speak German, and B, could he speak English?
He certainly couldn't speak English, and I only have very rudimentary German, and my Latin isn't good enough either. So I don't know we'd be able to talk about a lot, actually, in that case.
Well, I don't know, because if I've got a time machine, then the chances are I've got such a thing as a Babel fish, for those who know what a Babel fish is.
Yeah, I was about to say Babel fish, surely.
We would understand each other. You said you're a bit of a buff then. Let me ask you a question, Martin Luther, because the more I've read about him, and albeit just a little bit, and forgetting, when he puts the papers on the door and starts the Reformation, as we know, a couple of things come to mind about Martin Luther, and perhaps you could clear them up for me if that's all right. Firstly, his wife had a license, the only license in the village, to make beer.
Yes, I believe that is the case, and I've been to Wittenberg, actually, and they had a kind of house where people would come and visit. This is why, I actually went to his dining room. They would eat from her produce. She made beer, but she was also kind of a great farmer. So they had good sausages, as typical of Germany. I imagine you'd get quite a lot of sauerkraut and great smoked sausages, pork products of all kinds.
Yes. And there was a second quote, something like, if beer makes you happy and gets you closer to heaven, then everyone has to drink beer. Or something like that.
I can't recall that quote, although he's an immensely quotable guy, right? He's got, if you type in Martin Luther quotes, you'll get hundreds of them.
Oh, really?
But also, like many famous people, there are quotes attributed to him that if you do a little bit of digging, it's not quite sure that he really said it. I'm not a drinker, so I don't want that quite to be true. But the thing about Luther is you've got Luther the monk before he kind of discovers that you're saved by grace and not by works.
Yes.
And he's skinny and miserable. And then the pictures of Luther after that are really fat Luther, because he discovers the joy of life, because he discovers the freedom of the gospel of Jesus Christ. So I think I always like to say that when I take tours or when I do lectures on Luther, I like to say, well, you've got skinny, miserable Luther and you've got fat Luther enjoying the freedom that comes from knowing he's right with God. There's a distinct psychological difference between the two.
Wow. I'm just thinking AM and PM. You could have A Martin and P could be Portly Martin.
Portly Martin. That's right.
Thank you. Now, I actually brew my own beer. So when I first read that a couple of years ago, okay then. Because I know, as you said as well, it's got like a dark side as well. And I think there's some things that happen later on in life where you could say, oh, why did he say that? That's not right. That's not Christian.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's important because I think actually all of our heroes, except for one, are flawed. And it's kind of dangerous to have heroes in a way, because then you find the flaws and you're either completely crushed or you hide the flaw.
Yes.
But he was a flawed individual, and I think he got some pretty important things wrong. So it's worth a full assessment of his kind of history and character. But then, who of any of us could say that we would have a clean record? Should we be assessed in the same sort of way? There's two types of wrong, I think, two types of assessment of a historical figure. One is, are they sort of exceptionally evil for their time? Do they invent new ways to do evil? Or are they simply a reflection of the world around them at the time? I think there's two different categories there. So you might say that, for instance, he's known for making quite strong comments against the Jews.
Yes,
they weren't the kind of comments that you'd find, or it wasn't the kind of ideology that you'd find in Hitler's day. Not by any means. It's unjustifiable and completely unacceptable, but he's not unusual.
Mm-hmm.
So in condemning him, you need to condemn a time. I think there's a sort of different way of assessing figures in history, I think, in that way.
Yeah, in fact, that seems to be a thing that's going on a bit now when you look at social media. And I don't know what it's like in Australia.
We still use pigeons down here.
If you check your press, you might find that, we've actually sent some people to the moon now. Okay, maybe not us.
Right.
And we have won the Ashes once or twice. On a serious note, I think you'll find that if you're in social media, you'll see that, like you said about hero, and then suddenly you find that the carpet is swept from their feet because they might have just said one thing that was wrong. And then you'll find now that social media is saying, well, actually, that was for a time then. It's still wrong, but that's for a time then. So, but then the other side of social media will say, no. Whatever they said 40 years ago doesn't count. It's still bad. And
it's so disappointingly shallow, the whole thing, really. It's sort of either whitewashing somebody or completely cancelling them.
Yeah.
I just think we need to assess these things in a more nuanced way, and also remembering that in 100 years' time, we'll be judged by history similarly. So we just better be careful. There's a phrase I think C.S. Lewis used to use, which was chronological snobbery. History prevents chronological snobbery. Proper assessment of history prevents kind of belief that the present is better, morally better than the past. I'm not sure that we really can say that it is. I think we are more enlightened in some ways, but less enlightened in others. So we just better be careful. I think we mustn't excuse what great figures of the past have said and done. We mustn't excuse them, but I don't think that means go and sort of have their statues cut down or, remove their names from their buildings necessarily.
Not that would happen over here, especially in Bristol, of course. That would never happen.
Never happen.
If you've heard of that story, then your pigeons are very fast flyers. That's all I can say.
I can't remember which figure it was in Bristol.
Mr. Colston.
That's right. You can do creative things with history. We've faced this with Indigenous people and the colonial experience here.
Yeah.
One move is to say, look, we must eradicate all signs of all celebration of colonialism, and instead replace that with a celebration of the Indigenous culture. And I think, yes, we should celebrate the Indigenous culture, but you can do that in dialogue with, so there's a statue of Captain Cook down in the park near where I live. Captain Cook, of course, inverted commas, discovered Australia.
Yes.
He was the first British person. The Dutch got here before. He discovered for British and claimed it. But someone said, well, why don't you could have a statue sort of answering it in another corner of one of the early known Aboriginal warriors, perhaps facing Captain Cook, or, like it's showing both parts of the story.
Yeah.
and it actually helps memory. To go back to Luther, in Wittenberg, if you go there, on Luther's church, there's two churches, the University Church and another church. The other church where Luther preached quite often, there is actually a horrible medieval monument. It's not Luther's monument or anything like that, but it depicts Jews sucking from the teats of a sow. And so it's a disgusting depiction. After the Holocaust and the Second World War, of course, there was a move to remove it. But the local Jewish community said, no, keep it. But then they have another monument there pointing to it and giving context and saying, we argue that it should stay so we remember just what we were like.
What was a statue then supposedly portraying?
Well, I think it was it was an anti-Semitic culture. It was an anti-Judaistic culture, and it was trying to demean the Jewish people as sort of, by caricaturing them as, of course, the Jews don't eat pork, find pork unclean. So the idea that they would be sucking from the teats of a sow is kind of blasphemous to them.
Yes.
The pictures were sort of caricatures on the statue. So I thought it was very interesting. It's a great way to do history. It's actually not eradicate it, because then you forget it, but you show it and then you contextualize and you comment.
Well, to the credit, I think anyway, of the mayor of Bristol at the time when the Colston statue was pulled down and thrown into the River Frome, if anyone wants to know what it was. Or they just say it was a docks, but that's another story together. When they pulled it out, it's like, well, what are we going to do with it? And the mayor said, no, this has to go somewhere. And so it should go to the museum. Like you say, context, so people can actually understand now why it was pulled down and who this Colston character was. And it's something you just said about 5 minutes ago. And congratulations, by the way, because I think this is the longest answer we've ever had for question one. You said we sometimes can be enlightened from our history of today, but also it can be sort of bad. I'm sort of paraphrasing it. So what did you mean by that?
I think in some ways we can see more clearly the sins of the past. I think I'd much rather be, if I were a woman, I'd much rather be a woman today than a woman 50, 60, 100 years ago. For example, I think we've advanced the rights of women in Western countries in many, many ways. By the same token, the internet is awash with the most vile pornography, which demeans women, and we allow it and even celebrate it. So
yes.
Can we really sort of point back to the 19th century and say, oh, it was terrible, what a misogynistic age? Well, yes, but are we really doing better now? And then we're doing better in some aspects, but we're really not in others. And you might say too, the more technology we have, the more ways we invent to do evil. I think the movie Oppenheimer was a really interesting kind of take on that, because it was saying, here we've unleashed the ultimate in technological prowess, the best that human beings can do. And the consequence is that we now have the ability to imagine mega death, which is just, what an appalling thing. On the other hand, you might say, well, that's kind of, it's kept the peace because we know we can do it. But still, can we look back at with any superiority?
Question 2. Who is your favourite biblical character or favourite biblical story or favourite parable, please?
Well, I always go to the prodigal son for that, which is my favourite character in that. I mean, that's interesting. I guess as an older son, I kind of feel affection for the older son, because affection's not the right. I resonate with the temptation of the older son to feel resentment. And so that really strikes me, that parable. It really kind of challenges me every time I read it. And I kind of, thanks to Dr. Timothy Keller, the preacher from New York, I find more in it every time I read it. So I think I find it hard to go past that. However, I'm going to have another go, and that is the woman at the well is a particular favorite story of mine, because, which again resonates. I think it's a very contemporary story, because the woman is searching for love and for authenticity. And that she meets Jesus, who is the man of her dreams in a way that she hasn't expected.
That's a great answer. Going back then to the prodigal son, and you mentioned Timothy Keller.
Yeah.
What really resonates with you then from what he's been saying in that story that most people go, I'd never thought of that?
Oh, well, he actually got a kind of book and then a video course you can do which I've done in a reading group. And I think what he says is that it's very profound, actually. He kind of shows that Jesus, the teller of the story, in a way, is the missing link in the whole story. Because the story of the son lost in a far country, ordinarily, it would be the older brother's job to go and get him back.
Yes.
But this older son doesn't. But we do have an elder brother who comes and gets us back. You know, we have had someone who's come to search us out. Can you hear my wife calling out for my kids?
Yes.
Do you want me to stop?
That's all right. That's fine. It's all part of the ambience.
Yeah, she's just calling people for dinner.
Oh, very
It's a
nice.
big house and people are all, it's a rectory. So what Keller suggests is actually that the story itself points to Jesus, who has come to find us. And I'm still thinking about that. I'm still thinking about whether that's true or whether that works in the board, whether that's the way to read it. But I find that's really important for Jesus's teaching, is that he's not just a teacher. You can't just kind of cut his teaching off from who he is. Even his great Sermon on the Mount is really about him. He actually does what he teaches.
Yeah.
It performs it, if you like. He's the living instantiation of the things he teaches, which is the most wonderful thing.
And it's amazing that you can just take one parable as well, and out of that parable come out with reams and reams and reams of things that you hadn't seen before.
Oh, I know. The thing is, right, some people claim Jesus didn't exist. Well, I mean, I, of course, think he did. However...
Yes. Phew, I'm glad you said that. Thank you for qualifying it.
If he didn't exist, then some genius in the first century wrote these stories, came up with this stuff that we're still talking about today, and it's sort of just inexhaustible.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's not much of an argument for Jesus' existence. I think there's better arguments. Like if you don't believe Jesus existed, you still have to kind of deal with the fact that there's a parable of the prodigal son and the good Samaritan, and they are sort of in just 100 or 200 words.
Yes.
As rich as any novel.
Putting you on the spot then, if this was a live TV broadcasting to the millions, and I'd go out with a microphone into the audience.
Put my makeup on.
Is this what I'm saying? No, you don't need it. You don't need it, sir. And I'll go out with a microphone into the audience, and one bright spark says, okay then, Michael, give me one logical reason to prove that Jesus existed. You've got 30 seconds before we go to the advert break. What would you say?
Oh, I'd say that the evidence that Jesus existed is better than the evidence that almost any first century figure existed. We have more evidence for him than any other, than almost any other figure. So I think, particularly literary evidence, we have evidence from people that he existed, certainly from people who are not Christians, like Josephus, a kind of Jewish collaborator of the Romans, and Suetonius and Tacitus, Roman historians from later on, as well as the evidence of the movement that he started. So it didn't come from nowhere. And if it didn't come from Jesus, it came from someone like Jesus.
Yes.
So either you have Jesus or you have someone like Jesus. So I think that's just the inescapable conclusion of history. And also the other thing would be, this is an argument from authority, there's no reputable historian that I think he didn't exist. People will argue about whether his miracles occurred, whether he was raised from the dead, and so on. But the evidence for his existence is held by historians of all stripes.
And then we go to the commercial break. Thank you. Great answer. Question 3. This could be interesting. If you were Prime Minister for the day, and bear in mind in Australia you have Prime Ministers like we do over here. If you're Prime Minister for the day...
For about a day. Yeah, they last for about a day here too.
They're not doing too well at the moment, are they? For the day, and could change any law or impose a new law. What would it be, please, Michael?
Yes, I felt like I might come up with a frivolous answer. There's a place down at Bondi Beach where I go for coffee, and if they only put lines on the road for people to park in, people would park closer to one another and there'd be more parking spaces. But because there are no lines, people park in this hugger-mugger fashion all over, haphazard and slapdash, and it's an outrage, I tell you. And if I were Prime Minister for a day, I would make sure that lines went in down at Bondi Beach and there'd be more parking spaces for me in the morning.
Well, I think that's a great answer.
It's social justice at work.
It is. Would you be able to get it through, though?
Knowing our local council, no.
Then you've got the unions. Yeah, well, how much are you going to pay us to do it? And you've got more chance of invading New Zealand, I would have thought.
Yes.
Looking out for all those letters coming from New Zealand as we speak.
Apparently, there is a part of the Australian Constitution which allows for New Zealand to become a state of Australia, which offer they haven't yet taken up.
Really? That's interesting. Can't see it happening anytime soon either, somehow.
No, I can't. We would actually make their rugby team worse.
Yes, but they're not doing exactly brilliantly at the moment either, are they? So,
well, they're second or third, but still, they're a long way ahead of us. So we haven't beaten them for years.
I remember when New Zealand couldn't even play cricket. Now look at them.
Yeah.
Very good. Question 4. Outside of family events, what has been your most enjoyable day out, please?
I'm a cricket fan, so I love going to the cricket. I remember going to see. Sorry if you're not a cricket fan.
I am.
I remember seeing Australia versus India in the mid-2000s, and I saw something like 480 runs scored in the day. A man called VVS Laxman hit a century, and then Ricky Ponting hit a century, and it was the most amazing slaughter on the bowling. It was very thrilling and exciting cricket. It was great stuff.
The only time I've seen Australia play cricket, I think it was about 1972 in the Ashes at the Oval, where the Chappell brothers got their centuries.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
1972?
Something like that. 72, 73, something like that. Yeah, I'm an old person.
Yeah.
I think my dad smuggled me out of school for a day so I could go and see it on the Friday. And saw my hero, Derek Underwood, and also my other hero, Alan Knott, behind a wicket.
Oh, fantastic. That would be something to see.
Yeah, it was great. Question 5. What has been your most embarrassing moment then, please, Michael?
Well, I'm a very clumsy person, so I've got lots of embarrassing moments. I mean, one of the most embarrassing moments was, in fact, I scraped my car with my wife and daughters in the car. I scraped it on a bollard in the shopping centre, and I was so cross. And I'm not usually a cross person, but I was so cross that I got out and kicked the bollard and broke a bone in my foot.
Sorry, can I applaud you? Because that's something I would have done.
The bollard seemed unconcerned.
Yes. That's something I would have done. It's very Basil Fawlty, really, isn't it?
It was extremely Basil Fawlty. It was like Basil Fawlty thrashing his car, birching his car when it broke down. No, the bollard, of course, had not jumped out in front of my car to scrape it. I had scraped it myself.
I don't know. I've noticed things happen, that when I'm playing golf, all of a sudden, as I'm putting, it's going straight for the hole. All of a sudden, the hole moves. There's some sort of tectonic plate thing going on, I think.
Okay. Yeah, all right. Well, maybe. But you're taking my side in this.
Yes, definitely. Rule 1, never kick a bollard again.
No.
Great, so thank you. Wow, we've got a better picture of you then, if that's okay. And let's take it up a gear. We've already sort of touched briefly on theological stuff, and there's also another word that I mentioned earlier on, and that's anthropology. You're interested in theological anthropology. So for those who don't know, please tell us exactly what that means.
Oh, yeah. Well, that's just talking about human beings in the light of God. So thinking through what Christianity means for being a human, what tells us about being a human being. And it's two really essential things that have influenced human culture that we all actually now, they're ideas that have shaped human culture in ways that we all experience. The first one of those is the idea of the image of God.
Mm-hmm.
It comes in the first chapter of the Bible. God made animals according to their kinds, but he only makes one creature according in his own image. And that's us. And so that gives us the idea that human beings have a sort of unique calling, unique vocation. It's interesting, he doesn't say, and you can see that because human beings can speak, or human beings have opposable thumbs, or human beings have great minds.
Uh-huh.
He just says we have a particular capacity for relating to him. And so it's both simple, profound, and kind of unexplained, or we have to discover it, or what we know is that there's something particular about us. From this thought comes the whole idea of human rights that we so value today. The idea that human personhood has a particular dignity, and that we owe one another a particular dignity, so particular rights, that we're all connected in that way, that we as a species are all connected. And also that somehow we have a value that even though animal life is very precious, human life is still more so. And even Richard Dawkins thinks this. It's interesting. So there are other atheists, and there's an atheist called John Gray who complains that Richard Dawkins, famous atheist, still holds on to this idea that human beings have a special vocation, a special and honoured place in the natural world. That's the first idea. And the second idea, equally powerful, equally simple, is that human beings are fallen, are sinful. This is why we have democracy. Right? It's kind of really important for our justice system and our political system, is that you can't trust us because we tend to selfishness and violence. And if we're left alone, if we're given too much freedom, it will end up in cruelty, anarchy, and actually the suffering of the least powerful. By the same token, too much government can produce the same results. So somewhere in the middle there, we manage our our human tendency to sinfulness. I mean, it's famously been said that original sin, the idea that all human beings are sinful, is the one theological doctrine that you can just prove by looking around you. And I think that's right. I think rather more optimistic or sunny versions of thinking about human nature is very dangerous stuff, because it just says if we get the system right, then everyone will behave right. And I just think history, the torrents of blood that were unleashed in the 20th century kind of prove this not true.
So with this in mind then, your latest book, Subjects and Citizens, A Politics of the Gospel, why did you want to write it?
Well, I've been interested in politics and Christianity for a long time, since the 1990s, when I read a raft of different theological writers who wrote very powerfully to me about in my mind, about the impact of Christianity on the way we think about politics now, and also the impact that we still could have by articulating some really important things about the way human beings act or should act when they get together. And increasingly in the 21st century, and particularly since 2016, I wonder what happened then, politics has been a point of real tension and anxiety. So people have talked about the decline and even the end of democracy. That's something unthinkable in, say, 1989, if you're old enough to remember the fall of the Berlin Wall.
Yeah.
It was the triumph of liberal democracy, because we thought communism has failed. The only system that will survive is liberal democracy. Isn't it wonderful? And the 1990s was sort of a kind of a relatively peaceful period and prosperous period. But since 2010, we've seen actually that optimism fade across the West and in many other countries too. And politics become a real point of division and tension, menace. And so I've noticed this in the church too. The church is not immune from it. That since the decline of Christianity in the West, I'd say, by the way, when we talk about the decline of Christianity, always got to say in the West, because Christianity in the rest of the world is increasing.
Well, that's interesting.
I think of 17 countries where Christianity is declining, 16 are Western, what we would call Western.
The 17th being?
I don't know. I wasn't there for the lecture, so I just heard the stat.
Antarctica, most probably.
Yeah, Antarctica's not doing so well.
In those penguins.
The penguins are resistant.
Yeah.
They're very resistant. There's a particular feature to the landscape in the West, but Christians and Christianity seem to be declining in numbers and in attendance and in political influence. And so there's an element of anxiety about that. And I want to actually say Christians shouldn't be so anxious, actually, because we've got something quite positive and non-anxious to say about politics.
Yeah, we did a podcast a couple of months ago leading up to the general election that we had over here. And it is interesting to see just how many famous Christian people we have in the UK. Throughout history, they're actually Christians, but also how many of them were fundamental in changing really important laws. What about Australia? What about famous MPs of the past?
What's really interesting in our country is that on both sides of the political equation, so our more conservative party, which we call the Liberal Party, is certainly found by people who had a sense of Christian duty. It was the party of the small business owners. We don't have an aristocracy here in Australia. So it was really the party of business, a small business, and people who started our major institutions, our newspapers, our banks, and our insurance companies. They all did it out of Christian duty, a sense that we needed institutions that were trusted.
Yes,
and so it was for the good of the common good that these institutions, not for accumulating capital or for producing dividends, that these institutions were started, including that political party. But then it's also true of the trade unions and of the Labor Party, which is actually very similar to the British Labor Party, that Christians were instrumental, both Catholic and particularly Methodist Christians, were instrumental in founding the Labor Party and very vigorous in its early days. And then in starting the welfare state here, it was very much argued for by Christians. Sometimes I think we get the American paradigm of politics, and we get that and we think that's the only Christian paradigm. So we think of Christians as small government libertarians, but against welfare, for instance, social welfare. But actually, that's not nearly the case in if you look historically, even quite recently. And so there are Christians across the political spectrum, and also I would say Aboriginal Christians who were instrumental in getting Aboriginal rights thinking off the ground, including a very famous Aboriginal man called William Cooper, I should say, in about the 20s and the 30s. He protested, I believe, to the German embassy during the Hitler regime after Kristallnacht as an Aboriginal delegation. We're protesting for the rights on behalf of the Jews of Germany. He's a remarkable man.
Wow.
There's numbers of those, actually. So you'll find Christianity motivated them in the kind of the building of trust in the trusted institutions and in movements like that. So what do you get? I mean, I love Tom Holland, the historian, not Spider-Man, the actor.
Yes.
This is precisely his view, is that in Western culture, both the left and the right are the stepchildren of Christianity. So you can find a kind of conservative values, yes, of the nation and duty to nation, that sort of thing. But also he's got this chapter in his book Dominion called Woke, where he says, well, woke, the idea, our progressive politics of today actually owes its formation to Christianity, even though it might deny it. So the idea of being compassionate to those who are weakest, that really is a Christian idea. It doesn't come from anywhere else.
Have you ever thought of going into politics? And if so, why? And if you haven't, why not?
I wouldn't go into politics because I think I'm doing something that's far more politically potent by proclaiming the lordship of Jesus, because I think that actually is transformative. I think there are Christians in politics who I admire immensely, as I say, on different sides of the political fence. And I think there's a place for Christians doing politics. But personally, I would rather see people transformed spiritually, because I think that is socially powerful. And I think that's been my particular gifting and opportunity.
See, that's a great answer, especially as the fact that if you look back in your past life, you're a minister, you've had to go to theological college, or do they call it seminary over there like they do in America?
College.
So you've got this background of theology, and of course, your dad was an archbishop as well. What do you remember of the times of seeing him maybe being lambasted by the press? Because having read on Wikipedia, so it has to be true, he might be deemed controversial at times. So how did you cope with that in your growing up years, and what do you think of him now?
I was 31 when he became the archbishop, so it was a bit sort of after I had already been ordained and had a family. So it wasn't quite the growing up years when he really ascended to that role. Well, first of all, I have known from an early age that you don't get the true story in the press, and the press doesn't understand religion at all. It just reminds me, whenever I know anything about a story, I read it in the paper, and it's so far from the truth that it reminds me that whenever I read a story about something I don't know about, that I should really be careful. But I am amazed at how we do fall for what media stories say, hook, line, and sinker. I think it's important to have the courage of your convictions, and you can be respectful. I think sometimes Christians, like other leaders, are lambasted because they've just got it wrong, or they've said things that are genuinely offensive or clumsy, or they've said the wrong thing in the wrong time. I don't want to be lambasted for that. John Dixon, a friend of mine who's an apologist and evangelist, he once told me that his aim in speaking in the media is to be neither mean nor dumb. And I've always taken that to heart. So I think it's a pretty good baseline. I hope I'm going to be not mean or dumb, but actually both kind and wise. But to be not mean or dumb is a good kind of frame. And so if you're attacked for being mean and dumb, well, then I have no sympathy for you. You have what's coming. But if you're kind and wise and people are still attacking you, well, then not the joke, but then it's their problem, not yours.
And this is why I was impressed with your dad, actually. I'm only going by what was reported in the media, so I wasn't there in a TV studio, but some person got out of his seat to ask him a question. And obviously it was a very personal question that could be filed under, this is really controversial, but it affects me because, you're having a go at me. And your dad was great. He wasn't mean. He wasn't dumb either. And he was able to answer him in a nice way. And hopefully that chap would have gone away and said, yeah, okay, I'll believe more or whatever, and start a conversation piece. And I think that's most probably what Jesus does as well. And Paul, especially when you look at in Acts, anyone that's controversial that asks him a question, he's able to acknowledge and just very slightly turn it around to be able to speak to that person on one-to-one. And it's something I think that we've lost now, that conflict resolution, whatever you want to call it, is lost. And that could be back again to social media. So what do you do?
Well, it is, because actual social media is kind of dehumanizing because we don't see the person at the other end. And actually, friendship's extremely powerful. Genuine friendship's extremely powerful. One thing we do on social media is we take face. We kind of shame-face people. And that's, if you're in an argument, you're trying to shame them. That's one of the great instruments. It's much harder to give face, if you see what I mean, to give honor.
Mm-hmm.
And it's much harder but more powerful and more effective long run, to actually be curious, just to be genuinely curious. I'm just interested in hearing why you think that, rather than see things as a competition. I mean, it's been my experience. I've interacted with people who I found were very unpleasant on social media, who it turns out in person are extremely pleasant. It's so just shows you that there's something unreal about the medium. The medium's designed to make us angry. I mean, I think it almost as attractive as pornography is there's a getting us angry.
Yes.
There's lust and anger are the two great sins of the internet. Outrage. We love being outraged. It's a kind of addiction to us. You know, we'd love to sit in our rooms and just get angry.
Yes.
It's a sort of hobby.
Well, to back up what you're saying, a previous guest, who also is Australian, this goes back over a year or so ago now, he was very prevalent in the social media side, and someone personally attacked him, so he invited him out for a cup of coffee, and they sat down and they became really good friends as a result, sort of thing, because you were prepared to listen to what the other person said. And that surely has to be a plus for Christians who want to get involved in this. Just don't make a bold or stupid statement, dumb or whatever. Be prepared to back it up, but also be prepared to listen. And I'm just thinking, in your career to date, what comes to mind on you saying, yeah, I'm so glad I did actually listen and not just shoot the person down in flames?
What, for me personally?
Yeah.
I suppose, I'm very good friends with a feminist professor of media, and it turns out is now a Christian.
Oh,
and
wow.
I never would have thought that. I mean, we didn't really cross swords but I did read her stuff in the paper and think, I still do sometimes. And I thought, I don't agree with any of that. But no, she's terrific, and she's been very helpful to me personally. We're good friends, and there are people, like that. It's sort of, I think friendships are a blessing, actually, and actually you can find surprising friends sometimes, finding surprising areas of collaboration or common ground.
Yeah.
I'd love to see people doing that more, approaching internet conversations like that, rather than approaching them as a battle to be won. Because of the riches that are actually available to us, we're sort of missing out, I think, if we don't sort of approach things with curiosity, approach people with grace, assume the best, not the worst.
Yes.
Assume that you don't know everything. That's a good starting point.
Never assume. Yeah, exactly. What is the state of spirituality like at the moment, certainly down in Australia, and the relationships with bishops and archbishops as far as the ordinary people are concerned?
Well, we don't have a state church like England, so for us, archbishops and bishops, there was a habit of asking them what they think, but I think what we're noticing now is actually they don't necessarily ask at all. We've come to a point of where people don't think we have any influence, so we're getting asked less. There was an Archbishop of Sydney who died a few years ago, and there wasn't even an obituary in the paper. So I found that quite intriguing.
Yeah.
Because usually there would have been, even 20 years ago, it would have been a given that you would have an obituary about a person who served in a high office in our land. Australians have never been very good at attending church, but they're spiritually interested. And so there's always, I think it's always possible to have a conversation, but the form of disbelief here, I think, is interesting in that it's white guys and girls who've stopped believing, but often it was the nominals. It was people who had a tribal affiliation to one of the parts of the United Kingdom, and that had a religious overtone. And we've now moved beyond that tribal distinction.
Mm-hmm.
So all the Macs, they were all Presbyterian, and all the O's, they were all Catholic because they were in Ireland, and all the Cornish, you were Methodist, by the way.
Yes.
And if you were English, you were probably C of E. And so we had that sort of tribal affiliation.
Sorry, did you say if you were Cornish and if you were English?
Yeah. I think if you're Cornish,
Last time I looked, Cornwall was in England.
yes, there's a Cornish independence movement. You watch.
Yeah, oh, the Kernos, yeah.
Oh yeah, do you watch out?
So we've upset those as well now. We're not doing too well here.
You've upset those. And if you were Northern Irish, you might be Presbyterian or Methodist or Baptist or whatever. So
Or Catholic now as well, yeah.
yeah, that's true. So if you were from those, so you would say, you would tick in the census, you would tick, what are we again, Mum? Oh yeah, that's right. We're Catholic. Tick. But now we don't even recognize our Irish, Scottish, Welsh. That kind of era has gone. So we don't then identify as Irish, so we don't identify as Catholic either, if you see what I mean. So in census terms, it was people who weren't even attending church in the first place who are now not identifying. And I think that's kind of interesting, and I think less alarming if you're in church than otherwise, than the media often thinks. People who attend church often find the people who don't attend church but identify as a bit annoying, actually.
Yeah.
Because they want us to kind of keep their buildings going and pay for it. They won't pay for it. So that's happened, and I would say the strength of Australian Christianity is very much Asian. So when I say Asian, I mean Southeast Asian, people of Chinese extraction or from that sort of background, or Korean. So I think the future of Christianity here is in those ethnic groups rather than in amongst the old white people like me.
What can you put your finger down as to why white people, if that's the right terminology these days, why they have no time for finding out who God is and who Jesus is?
Because we got rich. I think partly it's our prosperity and affluence. And so we became smug and self-satisfied. I think that's it. I think it's part of it. I think the church, on the other hand, we've sort of not really nurtured our young people. We've lost a lot of trust through child abuse scandals that have affected the Catholic Church, but actually impact all churches, really. So we lost a lot of trust. I think white people, I don't know if I should, should I talk this way? People of Anglo-Saxon heritage also now have very small families and don't want to use their leisure time on church. There's a number of different things like that. I think they would see, a lot of Anglo-Saxon people would see themselves as socially more progressive and see the church as opposed to that as well. So there's been a buying of a narrative of liberation from the old ways of the church. The church is boring. And I would say also it's very interesting when you see in the media religion depicted. Religion is always othered, or it's very exciting if it's African Christianity. We love gospel music. We look at sort of old hymns and we go, oh, that's dire, or that's, it reminds us of cold stone buildings. And so, I mean, that's for people who don't go to church. I think there's a sort of romanticizing of the other. The attraction of Eastern religions is very strong amongst Anglo-Saxon people because it's seen as more authentic.
Oh, really?
Yeah. Because you can have it like a consumer product, I think, because you can just purchase a weekend away. So spiritual, not religious, is very kind of that's an increasing identity that people have.
Oh, really? People are getting, I think, more and more disillusioned. Certainly where I live, I'm meeting more and more Christians who reluctantly go to church, they've just lost interest, like you say, through scandal and stuff. So in your walk of life, what do you say to those people to encourage them to say, don't give up, actually? What would you say?
I would say there's no point me kind of whitewashing the past. I mean, I would reassure people that we take those issues of integrity extremely seriously. The other thing is, I would say, I think Christianity is not just its institutions. So I would encourage them to form groups, to meet together, find Christians and meet together, and have a Bible study group if you can, or a home church, if you're finding institutional church just too hard. But on the other hand, I think the claim of the church never was perfection, actually. And so sometimes I feel like people are expecting of a church group something that just doesn't exist and never was claimed to exist. Because actually, parish churches are beautiful little places in which miserable human beings kind of treat each other sometimes badly, but also perform remarkable acts of love. This is the unsung story of the local church, is actually, you find in local churches extraordinary blessing. And local churches bring together people who are very different and navigate intergenerational relationships, or people of different classes or economic statuses, in ways that are I just don't know where else that happens.
Yes.
You know what they say: if you ever find the perfect church, don't join it because you'll spoil it.
Yeah,
I think
it's true.
I think expecting perfection is an unreasonable expectation, and remembering that the church, even in its kind of imperfection, is still the church for whom Christ died.
Yes. A previous guest, not so long ago, and it resonates with me even now, he says that he thinks the church currently has got it wrong because they keep trying to get people saved, but actually, instead of talking about the gospel message that is known currently, we're missing the point. We should talk about Jesus and the resurrection, because without the resurrection, we wouldn't have a message in the first place. What do you think?
Oh, yeah, 100%. I think actually the key is looking away from it's looking to the Lord. It's actually being a way by which people can see Jesus better. I think that's right. I think there's been a humbling of the church in the West, and it's actually possibly opening us up for a more authentic and more exciting form of Christianity. Exciting, when I say exciting, I don't mean bells, smells, light shows and smoke machines.
Yeah, don't get me going on that subject.
Yeah, I mean, and not that, but really a more authentic, a more Jesus-like Christianity. I think that's the opportunity, because we're just more humble and maybe a little bit more relaxed about, less worried about numbers, bums on seats,
Yes.
social influence, all the kind of corporate markers that you might expect. If we're less worried about those and more worried about the authenticity of our faith, do we pray? I mean, that's a good question. I think a prayerful church would be remarkable, because prayer is such a countercultural activity. It looks so useless, and yet it's so powerful and profound, And as I say, I think actually prayer is the ultimate political activity, because you're saying, here is the Lord. Christ is the Lord, not, in our case, Anthony Albanese or Sir Keir Starmer or whoever it may be.
Yeah. We could carry on this. I think we just literally scratched the edge of the surface here, talking about prayer, but unfortunately it looks like time is beating us. And before I get to the very last question, just so we can sum it all up about your book as well, how did you get the former PM of Australia and also the Deputy First Minister of Scotland to endorse your book? And of course, the book is, and you can say what the name of the book is.
So the book's called Subjects and Citizens, The Politics of the Gospel. So I've already talked about it a little bit here, what the need it's addressing. And I'm hoping that it really helps people find refreshment and a sense of renewed confidence in the gospel and in actually the authority of Jesus. And then a new way to do politics, not to despair, not to kind of fret that either Donald Trump or Kamala Harris, depending on your views, will be elected and the world will come to an end. But actually, we've got things to, if you're in the church, there's things that you can be doing that are actually extremely potent in a genuinely political sense.
Yeah.
Because we're actually serving the authority of the one who really is in charge. John Howard is the former Prime Minister of Australia, and I know he goes to church. And a man in my church used to work as his research assistant. And so I just reached out through him, through the research assistant. It's all about who you know, you see.
Isn't it just?
And then the Deputy First Minister of Scotland, Kate Forbes, is a very impressive, very young woman. And her faith is really, she has endured enormous criticism for her faith, because she was a candidate. British listeners will know better than me, but she was a candidate for First Minister.
She was.
And would have been excellent. May still be, I think. But the press got onto her and said, oh, you can't hold on to conservative religious beliefs and be a public official. And then they appointed a Muslim. So how that worked, I don't know. But anyway, they really rounded on her, and her party did as well. They said you can't hold these two. And likewise, Tim Farron, who used to be the leader of the Lib Dems, again, a very fine man, and I think a fine servant of his nation as a politician. He likewise was told that he couldn't hold religious views that were in conflict from his social liberalism. And this is the weird thing that we don't get, is that we can actually have a pluralistic society where people don't agree on stuff, and you can actually hold a particular view personally, but allow for a diversity of views politically. That's really hard for our current political climate and current media to understand. And I think these Christians do that admirably. They're not demanding everybody become a Christian by any means. They're just humble. I think they're humbly serving their constituents. And so I was very proud to find these people and have them endorse my book, because I didn't feel like they were just simply party political. And in fact, it was really important to me that they sort of come from a spectrum of political opinion.
Yeah, it certainly got my eyes popping out, thinking, oh, you got that person, you got, wow, absolutely. Well, as I said, time's running out. We've just got time now for the final question, Michael. And I thank you so much for what you've shared so far. And hopefully we can get you back again and you can discuss more and we can go in depth more on, say, prayer or whatever, for instance. But in the meantime, you alluded to at the very beginning about maybe we shouldn't have heroes. But Michael P. Jensen, who is your Christian hero, please?
Well, and this is a kind of cheat. I wanted to say Dietrich Bonhoeffer. That's too perhaps cliched.
No, he hasn't been around too many times. And there's a film coming out about him soon as well. But anyway, that's another story.
I believe so. Although I'm worried a little bit because he's been weaponized.
Oh, has he?
Well, I feel like he's been weaponized by certain elements in America, sort of as if he would be a sort of pro-Trump evangelical, which I find remarkable.
How does that work?
Well, Eric Metaxas wrote this biography of him, and then Eric Metaxas sort of painted Bonhoeffer as a American conservative evangelical, which is not true. I would identify more as an evangelical, and I don't think Bonhoeffer was quite that, but he's certainly a very remarkable man. But this is my way of cheating. I think one of my hero is Archbishop Janani Luwum from Uganda. He was archbishop under the reign of Idi Amin, who was the dictator of Uganda in the 1970s, and who was a really comically evil but still nastily evil man who kept the heads of his enemies in a fridge. And they say that the crocodiles in Lake Victoria were always looking fat because he used to put his victims in there. And Archbishop Janani Luwum was actually criticized for not protesting enough by other Christians, but he did speak powerfully and strongly in protest against Idi Amin, and then one day was actually just plucked from his home, and then his bullet-riddled body was found some days later because Idi Amin had him executed. And I think Janani Luwum was a very brave man in the name of Jesus Christ, in a terrible, just awful circumstance. But because of the witness of people like him, African Christianity is stronger than it's ever been. And there are Anglicans. Would you believe that the most likely Anglican you would meet in the world today is a young African woman? And I think it's because of people like that. I wish we had more of them.
See, I love it when we have someone that I've never heard of before, maybe to my shame as well.
There's a statue of 20th century martyrs at Westminster Abbey, and Dietrich Bonhoeffer's there, and Archbishop Janani Luwum is there as well.
Oh, really? Oh, fantastic. Well, very quickly flying a flag for him then. What else should we know about him? Where did he grow up and all that sort of stuff?
That's all I know. I've told you. That's pretty much the story. But there's stuff to read about him, written by one of his bishops, a bishop called Bishop Festo, who was once called the Billy Graham of Africa. Although I think that's a bit unfair, because maybe Billy Graham should be called the Festo of America.
Oh, very good.
It's a very Western way to think of things. He was an extraordinary evangelist who visited Australia actually in the 1970s, and his visit is still remembered.
Wow.
So there's stuff to read about the Archbishop from that.
Wow. Well, we never did talk about martyrdom and identity as your chosen subject for your doctorate.
Well, that's partly why I would say is that the witness of people like Janani Luwum and Dietrich Bonhoeffer, and that really intrigued me, that here's an expression of the Christian life that really is inherent to all Christians. It's just that all Christians don't get the chance, the privilege, you might say, of dying for our faith. But in a sense, we all take up our cross and follow Jesus. We're all supposed to do that. We all die to ourselves. And so they're a demonstration of what's really the call that's come to everyone who would follow Christ.
Wow. Die to self. That's another of the subjects that seems to be cropping up throughout all these podcasts. Michael, thank you so much for spending valuable time. I really appreciate it. And hopefully we could get you back again in the not near too distant future so you can share more, because it's amazing what you've come out with so far. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks for having me, Martin.
God bless. Next time on Off-Grid Christianity.
He said, I was sitting there and I was praying to God, and I was saying, I feel like I'm doing this all by myself. I feel like I'm praying all the time and you aren't answering my prayers, and I'm ready to quit. And I'm going to quit unless you tell me something or do something to keep me being a pastor. And he said, Richard, that's when you came over and told me that.
Wow.
And all I would say is take the risk. And how much do we miss when we don't, because of our own timidity or our own fear of looking stupid? Yeah. I'd say do it in love. God will make it right.
So please join me for the next episode of Off-Grid Christianity with special guest Richard Porter. Until then, cheerio.